That night, James sat outside, almost for the entirety of it, and stared up into the bright, star-speckled sky. Among the myriad of glowing dots up there, he had been looking for a particular pattern. After scouring the information available to him, he had managed to find the rough position of a certain yellow star that was glowing far away, somewhere in the Orion Arm. He had found out that, at this time of year, and with some luck involved, he should actually be able to see it from this position. Too bad he was already bad enough at spotting any human-discovered star signs back on Earth, where stars in the sky were rather limited. In this wild spray of dots, and with almost completely unfamiliar patterns, it had taken him hours to find the crooked, irregular spiral, of which the fourth star from the right of the second curl would be the sun. Still, he had the time, and he was determined, so finally, when his eyes were already hurting quite a bit from squinting at the bright sky, he managed to spot the pale white dot. From all the way out here, it really didn't look like much. Just one small dot among thousands. But still, somewhere around that dot, he had been born. He had grown up. Somewhere there was his home. He just sat there, thoughtlessly staring at it for a bit, not daring to take his eyes off the dot since he was unsure if he would be able to find it again once he averted his eyes for even a second. Hard to imagine that, at this very moment, millions of tons of metal were tearing towards him at speeds massively faster than light, bringing a small army's worth of humans, and weaponry with it. Once she arrived, the other sun would block out a good part of this night sky. Against the backdrop of this many stars, it would be a sight to behold. Time would tell if it would be a sight of awe or one of terror. James just really hoped that whoever was at the helm of that ship right now knew what they were doing. That did bring up a good question. Who had command over the sun again? Must have been one of the admirals, of course, but he couldn't remember who. No one he had ever had any close contact with, he was sure. It was probably better that way. It left some pesky biases out of the way. If the government had sent someone he knew personally, he would likely have been more worried. There were a lot of possible candidates he wouldn't want to have around. An unknown face was preferable on that front. Still, he had no idea what was going to happen now. Whatever humanity was planning, it was mostly out of his hands now. All he could do was play his part and try to ensure nobody who didn't deserve it got hit in the process. And that he would get the location where his friends were being held out of the matriarch. His hand clenched into a tight fist at the thought, and he could feel his nails digging into his skin. He had to plan for things to come, but what could he plan? He had no idea what was going to happen. Never before had he realised this strongly just how much not being in the loop of things stunk. Whenever things had been at their worst before, he was used to being privy to all the critical information. But he had left that behind him. He had been glad to do so, and now he was completely in the dark. Still, he spent the rest of the night planning out and trying to work around likely or at least possible scenarios he could try to anticipate. At least he hoped they were likely or possible. In the end, he couldn't come up with anything substantial. He just knew too little. Still, in his pondering and vain planning, he at least managed to kill some hours, and soon the land was dipped into a pale light as the system's star slowly peeked its bright face over the horizon, shooting long, bright rays like spotlights through the morning mist. Sleep, or even tiredness, had not found him that night. But now, when the stars he had been admiring, and especially the pale face of his home sun, was starting to get drowned out by the main star's light, he felt his motivation to remain out here waning. With a yawn, he pushed himself off of the cushiony, mossy underground and jumped up to his feet. Even after just a few days of training, he already felt much more competent, as well as confident, on his feet again, as his muscles started to remember the shape they had once been in, even if they were still quite a way away from it. Slowly, and still thinking of what's to come, he meandered towards the estate. As usual, he was let back in by some of the guards, and he tried to decide if he should just sleep the day away, seeing as the sun, and the ambassador she brought with her, would arrive the next day. However, as he suddenly strolled through the halls and corridors, a sound caught his ears. A clacking, followed by a flat foot hitting the ground, followed by another clacking shortly after. What is he doing out this early? James wondered to himself, stopping in place for a moment while he listened to Reprise's steps. Rising at sunrise wasn't exactly something many people around the estate did, unless it was specifically required of them. His curiosity piqued, and since his brain was looking for a distraction from the foreboding of the future anyway, he decided to investigate. It was easy enough to follow Reprise's footsteps, now that they were accompanied by the loud clacking of his crutch. No longer was he sneaking around and barely audible. For a second, James almost felt bad about the thought, since he was responsible for the rodent's circumstances. but then he remembered why he was responsible for them, and the twinge of guilt vanished from his mind again. In contrast to Yrrol, James's loss of his arm didn't inhibit his ability to sneak around, and in an ironic reversal of roles, he soon found himself creeping after the limping man, while remaining out of sight. Yrrol seemed twitchy and nervous. He looked over his shoulders often and lifted his ears, listening for any sounds. Clearly he was not keen on being followed. But, just as Yrrol had been good enough to follow him around while being barely noticed for a good while, James in turn was also good enough to remain out of the rodent's sights, as he followed behind him. Apparently they were both much better at following someone than at realizing they were being followed. Thus, the officer slowly and unknowingly led his unwanted company through the estate, until he finally arrived at a strange door that certainly wasn't Yrrol's room. It was an old door that seemingly had at some point not been replaced together with every other door of the building, and therefore stood out as an oddity among the uniformity. James had noticed it before, of course, but so far it had always been locked shut, and he couldn't remember anyone going in or out of it, at least not when he had been around. The door was made of darker wood than its newer brethren, and its age clearly showed from scratches, smudges, and signs of wear on both the wood and the metal of its handle. James had to pull his head behind a corner, since Yrrol was making extra sure nobody was around to watch him, now that he had reached his goal. Therefore he could not see what the rodent was doing from now on. However, he could still hear it, and luckily, it was all he needed. Knock, knock. Knock, 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 knock. Knock, knock. Knock, knock, knock. A clearly predetermined and deliberate pattern of knocks against the door rang out. It almost warmed James's heart to hear something as familiar as a knock sign. 2 knocks, then 4, then 2 again, and then 3. James memorized the pattern and repeated it to himself, while he heard the door open. Yrrol's steps quickly entered whatever was behind it, and then the door was quickly closed again. To avoid suspicion, James decided that it would be best to wait for a few minutes, before he barged in to crash the party. His heart beat a bit faster. Clearly, whatever was behind that door was a cut above the rest when it came to secrecy. Could that be where? No, he decided, with a strict shake of the head. No matter how much he wanted to hope against hope, the matriarch was many things, but she wasn't foolish enough to imprison his friends in the same place he was being held. Even if he had forced her to act reckless every now and again, when she had the time and opportunity, she was too careful for that. That much was shown in her more well-formulated plans that had not been interrupted by a meddlesome Deathworlder. No. Something else had to be behind that door. But what could it be? He would have to find out for himself, and after a few minutes had finally passed, he decided to do just that. Briskly, he walked up to the door, looking up at the massive wooden frame. Once again, he was reminded just how out of place he was in a place like this. When he lifted his hand, that was a mere speck of dust when compared to the enormous piece of wood. 2 knocks, then 4, then 2 again, and then 3. He repeated the pattern he had previously heard and hoped that it wasn't personalised for everyone who had to enter this place. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and James began to fear that that was exactly the case, and inside, Yrrol was now being informed that someone tried to impersonate him with his knock sign. But before he could lose hope and turn tail before it was discovered by someone that it had been him who eavesdropped on the pattern, he could hear the mechanism of the door's lock disengage, and since he hadn't expected it to open towards the outside, he had to dodge the wall of wood as it was suddenly swung open towards him. The massive draft of air that it brought with it blew over him, wildly throwing his long hair all around, and James shielded his eyes from the wind with his hand. On the other side of the door stood what was clearly another Zoditus ball, although smaller than the rather unpleasant specimen he had gotten to know so far. The Colossus's 6 eyes looked down at James appraisingly, and he had a surprised expression on his face. Obviously, he wasn't expecting the prisoner of the estate to be privy to a secret knock sign that would allow him entrance to whatever he was guarding. James could basically see the man's thought process, as he was trying to figure out if he was paid enough to care if someone who clearly shouldn't have it had access to the knock sign, or if he should just follow his orders to let anyone in who knocked on the door the right way. The fact that it needed considering at all already told James that he may have overestimated the amount of importance that the contents of this room held. Finally, a decision was made, and the Titan nodded his head respectfully. "Ambassador," he greeted, and stepped to the side so James could enter through the door. James returned the nod and hurried past the man, only to be stopped when he arrived at a large drop in the floor right in front of him. Standing at the edge of what must have been the drop of at least 2 meters, he stared down, trying to figure out what something like that was doing within a house. Right after the first drop came another one, and then one more. Only after a few seconds of blank staring did he realise that they were stairs. Stairs leading downwards, and clearly not meant to ever be used by something human-sized, or probably even a young Tshirt. "You need any help with that?" the large bull asked from behind him, as he pulled the old door shut once again. With a look down at the sheer number of stairs, James chuckled awkwardly. "Appreciate it," he replied, and quickly allowed himself to be picked up by the man. Usually it would have likely been embarrassing to have been carried down a flight of stairs like a toddler. However, he was long over feelings like those in his current situation. Still, he could have imagined nicer forms of transportation than being loosely carried in the swinging, unstable trunk of a Tshirt. Once they had reached the bottom of the stairs, James was unceremoniously set down on the floor, and the Tshirt indicated that he could go on by himself from here on. Some distance away he could hear voices. One was Reprig. The other one was also familiar, but he couldn't place it right now. "Make sure you two leave together," the bull commented once James started the walk. Clearly he didn't want to make the trip while carrying somebody more often than strictly necessary. James confirmed with a gesture, before hurrying in the direction of the voices. The space at the bottom of the stairs was a hallway that reminded James of a spaceship. The walls, floor and ceiling were made of metal, and along the sides were rows of strong-looking metal doors that were much more massive than the wooden ones upstairs. It almost seemed like his first guess hadn't been that far off. This certainly looked like a prison to him. One that could hold something as big and as strong as a Tshirt. But they couldn't be here, could they? The other voice certainly wasn't one of theirs. The closer he got, the more he slowed his steps, trying to not give away his presence immediately. By now he could see that the voices were coming from an open door a few more meters down the hall. Stopping right next to it, he could also finally make out what they were saying. "Listen, this isn't my fault and you know that," Reprig's voice rang out exasperatedly. "Can't you see I'm only trying to help you?" The other voice replied, warped to a mocking, imitational sound, like the one a child would use when mocking the way someone else spoke. "Listen, this isn't my fault and you know that. Can't you see I'm only trying to help you?" The higher voice mocked him, with exaggerated speaking patterns and a nasally tone, before dropping back to what was apparently its normal tone and adding, "That's how you sound." A heavy accent had suddenly appeared with it, and now James knew who was in that room. Just to confirm it to himself, he peeked around the corner, seeing that he had been right. In front of Reprig, who was standing straight in the middle of the room, was the many-eared, antlered form of Skye, lounging on an uncomfortable-looking mattress that was carelessly put onto the floor next to the far wall of the room. It almost looked like she had grown a bit in the weeks since James last saw her. Her antlers certainly had. And she had been robbed of all her pouches, belts and bags that previously had been strapped to her body, wherever she had room. But it was her. The cat's ears doe eyes looked at Reprig expectantly, waiting for her mockery to have an effect on the man. However, instead of acting mad or insulted, Reprig actually looked quite happy to James, satisfied in a way. "That wasn't half bad," Reprig said, dropping his straight posture, as he instead leaned onto his crutch. "Not one word mispronounced in that sentence. Looks like you actually have been paying attention all this time." Skye appeared to be a bit taken aback at the sudden compliment, and she quickly averted her eyes from the man, mumbling something in a language James didn't understand. Reprig put on a complacent smile while looking at the young woman. James took a moment to study Skye's appearance. While it didn't look like she had been treated very well by any stretch of the imagination, she also didn't look neglected or mistreated. Her fur was kempt, and she seemed to be in good health at least. However, she clearly didn't enjoy anywhere near the same freedoms that James had around the estate. The thought that Tur would even imprison a child in a place like this, while not being altogether surprising, still gave James a bitter taste in his mouth. It also made him wonder what Reprig of all people was doing down here with her. "Let's continue for today. You must be hungry," Reprig said, and pushed himself up straight once again while looking at Skye candidly. "Whatever," Skye replied, and although she was still using her normal voice, James noticed an absence of her accent that time. "Anything you want to talk about?" Reprig asked the girl openly, and took up an authoritative yet respectful posture that reminded James of a teacher, maybe? Skye seemed to think for a moment. "The guards have been mumbling," she started. However, Reprig almost immediately and loudly cleared his throat while putting on a strict face. Skye looked at him rebelliously for a second, but she still started over with a bit more concentration. "The guards have been mumbling about some large ship coming towards us. Is that true?" Reprig seemed surprised for a moment that she knew about that. However, he still applauded her efforts before he answered. "Very good," he said happily. "And yes, a large ship escorting a human ambassador is on its way towards us. It seems the humans want to talk to James personally. How is he? Skye asked unprompted and curiously, which caused Reprieve to almost immediately clear his throat in the same way he had already done. With a sigh, Skye got ready to repeat her question once again, but James decided it was about time he revealed himself now. He had questions he wanted answered, preferably before his fellow humans arrived. I'm fine, thank you for asking, he loudly announced, stepping around the corner and clearly shocking both other Deathworlders within, as they twitched around with surprised expressions. How are you? A roller coaster of emotion rushed over Reprieve's face, going from surprise to confusion, to a slight anger, and finally to an acceptance. Skye, however, seemed to just be surprised. Apparently foregoing the question of how James had gotten in there, Reprieve sighed and shook off his inner turmoil with a quick shake of his entire body. What are you doing here? The rodent asked, laboriously turning on the spot, which was hindered slightly by him having to use his crutch. James shrugged. Currently rethinking my life's decisions while a human warship is barreling towards me at an unbelievable speed, he admitted, and simultaneously dodged the question. While Reprieve shook his head in dissatisfaction, James noticed Skye scrambling to sit up straighter on her mattress. Hey, James, she greeted him with a mixture of happiness and nervousness, making James wonder just what Reprieve had told the girl about what James was doing up there above her head. Hey, Skye, long time no see, James greeted back. All good? Yes, all good, Skye replied with a quick nod of her head. James also noticed her making an actual effort to not talk with her accent now, which was strange as he had never minded it that much. James nodded and then turned back to Reprieve. You're in the business of kidnapping children now? He asked in an accusatory manner, and looked at Reprieve strictly. It wasn't my first choice, Reprieve replied defensively, but after the chaos you'd caused, it wasn't affordable for her to just run around on her own. And, well, she also wasn't fit to be working for us any longer, as we no longer had a task for her. Not with the way she was back then. James shook his head disapprovingly. So the second she wasn't useful anymore, they dropped her like a hot potato, but they wouldn't let her go because of the forbidden knowledge they had given her in the first place? The poor kid. Still, Reprieve's phrasing was odd. And now you're trying to make her different from the way she was back then, he assumed with a distrustful look at the rodent. How awfully nice of you. And uncharacteristic, I might add. Well, it wasn't what I wanted to do either, Reprieve immediately defended himself, in an outburst that seemed quite emotional. Apparently, Reprieve himself only really noticed this outburst after it had happened, and he quickly recollected himself, clearing his throat and straightening out his fur before he continued. I would have just kept her down now once the decision was made. However, when we tried to do that, she refused to eat. James looked up at that. Refused to eat, he repeated worriedly, and glanced over at Skye, who started wrapping her arms around her legs, pulling them closer to her chest. I'm not taking no arms, she mumbled, partly as an explanation and partly reaffirming it to herself. Apparently that philosophy of the Ketzer extended even to situations where you were taken prisoner. Reprieve nodded and continued his explanation. As you can see, she's still not over that backwards thinking from her homeworld, he commented with a resigned gesture with his open palm. She refused to take anything from us unless we gave her a task in exchange. A real headache, that one. Poutingly, Skye pulled her legs in even closer to herself, and looked away as James gave her another appraising glance. While he didn't agree with the phrasing he used, he had to admit that it was, at least ignoring all the surrounding circumstances of her capture, quite the pickle that her captors had found themselves in. He too wondered, under very different circumstances, how would he help someone that didn't want to be helped? And you decided to give her language lessons, James concluded, and Reprieve nodded. We had to give her something to do, and she may have been a petty thief once, but unlike some of the ilk you surrounded yourself with, she is not yet beyond help, Reprieve explained himself, and leaned his weight onto his healthy leg, so he could lift his crutch to point at Skye with it. She's still young, yet she's already capable, and she may be a Deathworlder, but so am I. If she learns to carry herself and behave properly, we can get some manners into her, and she learns to follow orders, there may be a place for her among us yet. So I offered her the exchange. She was taught to learn to be a functioning member of society, and in exchange she could take whatever we gave her without remorse, and in time she may even be able to leave the cell behind her in its entirety. In a very roundabout and kind of disturbing way, should one think too much about it, it was almost nice of Reprieve. The thought of it, at least. Clearly he wanted to help, he was just too stuck in his own head to actually do so. Still, the methods were uncomfortable for James. They reminded him of a dark time in Summerverse history, but he could do nothing about it now. At least it seemed that Skye had remained in somewhat good spirits about it. So far. So, even you are worried about the humans arriving? Reprieve suddenly asked, bringing the conversation back to James's first comment unexpectedly. course I am, James replied. There's a lot on the line for me. And the Sun, well, the Sun is a very big ship. Honestly, I think they probably just want to show off, but I'm still a bit nervous. Do you know the ambassador that will be arriving? Reprig asked. And the so long missing tick of his to compulsively lick his trunk returned for just a moment. James shook his head. I can't say. I haven't heard a name yet, he answered honestly. Reprig nodded. However, Skye had a better question ready. Well, is there anyone you don't want it to be? Admir! Andrej loudly yelled through the echoing hangar, where the last preparations for the mission were being made. Are you done checking those parachutes yet? The First Lieutenant Rexer popped his head out over the edge of the large container, disguised as a discarded old fuel tank he was currently working on top of. Almost finished, boss, he yelled back at the Major, and briefly scratched his head with the wrench he was holding in his right hand. But, are we sure they won't care if we literally drop this thing on them? It's not exactly, well, small. He gestured with both hands at the absolute size of the container. Andres groaned, realizing that clearly Admir had only been reading his own part of the updated mission briefing, and neglected to also study everyone else's part of the mission. He made a mental note to discipline the lieutenant later. However, right now it was quicker to just answer his questions so everyone could keep working in peace. As you should know by now, we've already contacted the planet and asked for permission to shed some ballast while we're planetside. As this is common practice after a journey through the entire galaxy, I guess even you can figure out that it was granted to us without much issue, he informed the First Lieutenant, exasperatedly, rubbing his eyes with his thumb and the knuckle of his index finger. We'll drop the container over a wooded area close to the target, where it could theoretically be easily retrieved and recycled by off-planet staff. As long as we're gone from the scene before they arrive, we should be clear. Although he had obviously understood the explanation, Admir still looked down at the container that he was preparing to be dropped, confusedly. However, he did not ask any further questions he should already know the answer to. Andres then turned towards Sam and Tuya, who were currently checking over their EVSs, or extravehicular void suits, that would be necessary for their void drive from the small planet's thermosphere. They would repeat this check at least 4 more times before the mission started, but they were still completely focused on the task. Remember that the planet is small and the air is thin, he reminded them, even if he was quite sure that it was not needed with those two. We're going to have to start decelerating early so that we don't have to open our chutes too high up in the air. I'd say we start at around 3 kilometers so we're down to speed, and ready to deploy once we reach 1,000 meters. The two women confirmed with a thumbs up without looking up from their suits, checking every square millimeter of it for possible weaknesses or damages. Andrej would check his own suit later, as soon as his team was finished with their preparations for the day. For now, he was stuck supervising them. Maybe stuck wasn't the right word. No matter how good you were, it was always good to have another pair of eyes on whatever you were doing, making extra sure that no mistakes managed to sneak themselves in. Still, watching his team do their thing, knowing fully well they were pretty much just as capable as he was, if not more, made him feel like he could be spending his time more wisely, even if he knew it not to be entirely true. As he found nothing better to do with himself, he meandered over to the large container that Admir was working away on top of. The mechanics and engineers disguising it had done a good job. It looked exactly like an old and worn fuel tank. Worn, scratched walls, smudges that are soaked deep into the metal, signs of corrosion even on the non-corroding material. He just hoped they had done half as good a job of making it work for its intended purpose as they had done disguising it. Andrej walked around the container to inspect its future contents. 3 ATCs, or all-terrain cycles, all freshly maintained, tanked up and polished, waited patiently to be loaded into the container. To a layman, they probably looked a lot like usual motorcycles. However, the massive chains connecting the wheels to the motors, the thick armoured wheels and the exterior metal plate spoke a different language just from the first look alone. For some odd reason, the mechanics had even taken the time to paint them in their tactical matte black colour, even though Andrej highly doubted that would make any difference at all. At least they were nicely matched with the overalls and masks now, so that was something. No matter where Andrej looked, everything appeared to be in working order. It looked like this mission could start without a hitch. They repeated those checkups and inspections many times over the final day, before the mission would begin. All weapons and vehicles were cleaned, assembled, maintained and stored where they belonged. All parachutes and backup parachutes were folded and secured perfectly. All EVSs were immaculate and flawless, and checked at least 4 times. Every team member was dressed for the job. Andrej, Sam and Tuya in the EVSs with black armoured overalls underneath, and Admiral in a black suit, tie and breath filter. Their shuttle was waiting for them, and the sun was in position to provide fire support if needed. The team had just held their last briefing, and everyone was now quietly waiting for their signal to go. Each of them copped with the mounting pressure and excitement so shortly before the mission began in their own way. Tuya was rhythmically nodding her head to some tune of music that she was conjuring up within her mind, zoning out to the beat that only she herself could hear, and tapping her finger on her knee. Sam was also completely engrossed in her own mind. However, she sat near motionless, only the faint rising and sinking of her body with each breath, indicating that she was still with them. Admir, who wasn't constrained by an EVS like the Major or their female colleagues were, was playing with a single metal coin. Dexterously, he let it dance over the back of his fingers with little more than minute movements, moving it back and beginning anew each time it reached the end of his hand. And then there was Andrej himself, who had to admit that he distracted himself from the stress of the upcoming task by watching his subordinates, making sure every one of them was coping with the situation all right. It was easier to worry about others than about himself. Finally, their order to move out came. As one, they got up from their seats, and in a close stack, they moved towards the shuttle. Inside, their pilot was already waiting for them. "I'll keep the bird ready for you all, but the rest is up to you," he informed them without a greeting. More wasn't necessary. They all knew the plan. "Understood, Captain," the Major replied while strapping himself in. "We'll keep you updated while on the ground. Thank you for getting our asses out of there." "All in a day's work," the pilot replied laughingly, and gave him a thumbs up. Admir walked past Andrej and took his place in the co-pilot seat, since he would be the only one out of the team who would remain within the shuttle until it landed. He leaned back in the seat, folding his hands behind the back of his head, and his voice rang out in a long sigh, amplified by the speakers within the breath filter. "Ah, sitting with the lower classes," he mused aloud and chuckled to himself. "Oh, the things I do for home and species." Andrej could hear the annoyed noises of Tuya and Sam, as they also strapped themselves in across from him. Once everyone was ready, the shuttle got its permission to take off. The hangar was cleared and the atmosphere voided, as its large doors opened up for them and gave way for the image of the brightly shining planet of Osnajar, illuminating the shuttle through its front window as it reflected the star's light. "That's the core world?" Tuya commented, now seeing it with her own eyes instead of on pictures or video feed. "What a pretty little pearl, but it doesn't hold a candle to our Earth." "We could crack it open like an egg," Sam dryly stated, while the image of the planet reflected in her visor as she stared at it. "That's not what we're here for," Andrej pointlessly reminded everybody while crossing his arms. "We're only getting James, then we're out of here." "Wouldn't need an RP to do that," Admir commented cheekily, and turned the mirroring front of his mask towards the Major. "Well," Andrej replied, and smiled to himself underneath his own visor. "It's always good to have a contingency plan." As they talked, the pilot was already starting to slowly drift the shuttle out into the void and towards the planet. A message came over the communication line. "Container out." The officer on the other side informed the pilot as well as the team. "Make sure to catch up to it before it leaves the thermosphere." "Understood, Lieutenant," the pilot gave back over the lines, as the planet was coming closer and closer. He then turned towards the team in the back. "You best be getting out of here, or that container is breaking the speed of sound before you left the shuttle," he stated, telling them only what they already knew. "Understood, Captain," Andrej replied, and together with Tuya and Sam, he unbuckled and made his way to the jump lock, which was nothing more than a pathetically small airlock that they could use as an exit point for their void drive. "See you on the other side," Admir yelled after them, before they could close the door. The door snapped shut behind them, and immediately, the hissing of an atmosphere voiding was audible. "Rush check," Andrej commented. "Earth time 2:41, local time 4:75, altitude 81 kilometers or 62,790 measures," Sam immediately reported back. "Check," Tuya replied, indicating that her values were matching up. "Check," Andrej also responded. "Ready to dive, ladies?" "I was born ready," Tuya replied, hitting her fist into a flat hand. "Ready when you are, Major," Sam replied more subduedly. The door opened, and the tiny bit of thin atmosphere that they had already entered rushed into the room, bringing with it the extreme temperature that was present even in these lowest layers of the thermosphere. Of course, inside their EVSs, they barely noticed the massive change in temperature, but without them, their lungs would be pieces of charcoal by now. "Ladies first," Andrej offered, and his colleagues didn't need to be asked twice. Tuya was the first one out, diving out of the open door and towards the brightly shining planet with reckless abandon, tearing towards the ground straight as an arrow. Sam was right after her, plunging out of the shuttle with a long swung dive. Finally, Andrzej hurried up behind her. Immediately, he felt the feeling of swimming through the air without any point to hold to, while his body accelerated through the resisting gas. All feeling of weight was gone, and he almost felt like he was standing still within his suit, despite reaching speeds that were near unimaginable to most people. In the distance, far under him, he could just about make out the small forms of Tuya and Sam. They had only jumped mere moments before him, yet it had been enough to give them a head start, at least hundreds or so of meters. His altimeter continuously tickled down, as the meters flew past him. Already he had passed kilometers in his fall. Soon after, his suit informed him that he had broken the speed of sound. Now he could see that Tuya had reached the container. She stabilized her fall to glide along beside it, also waiting up for her teammates in the process. Sam had quickly caught up to her, and so had Andrzej just moments later. The altimeter still ticked down. They had only fallen for some minutes now, but they already left the thermosphere, and they wouldn't spend much time in the mesosphere or stratosphere either. Slowly, the planet became more than just a glowing orb. They could make out details and distinguish areas. Andrzej stared at the luscious plains and greenery they were heading towards, the systems of their suits constantly updating them on the corrections they should make to land at the right spot. Minutes passed like that, just weightlessly gliding in the upper atmospheric layers. Then they hit the troposphere, just a few more kilometers until deceleration. Andrzej made sure to get the attention of his teammates, although it was completely unnecessary. They had been watching him this whole time. Lifting his hand and moving it from a flat to a knife hand and back to a flat, he indicated to start the deceleration. Immediately his team complied, pushing themselves away from the container and spreading out their arms slowly, releasing a folded membrane with a mechanism inside their suits. The thin, yet extremely robust membrane unfolding and spread out, sewing their fall gently without bringing it to a crawl like their parachutes would. That way, they could slow down below the speeds of sound, and their bones wouldn't be shattered once they deployed their chutes. At an altitude of 1 kilometer, they saw the parachutes of the container automatically deploy, and it decelerated so fast that to them, it looked like it suddenly shot upwards. Synchronously, the team now also deployed their parachutes. Andrzej could feel it yank on him like a punch in the gut. The green floor suddenly turned into discernible trees. A nearby brown spot had turned to a city with houses. Detail after detail came into view as they slowly descended onto the planet, making sure to stay close to the container from now on, as if they were part of the ballast that the ship had shed. Heavily, with a loud impact that shook the young surrounding trees, the container contacted the ground first, surely followed by the 3 humans. Now everything had to move fast. Without much time to recover from the quite taxing jump, the 3 of them shed out of their EVSs and rolled up the parachutes around them. Sam was the first to be completely free of it, and immediately she hurried over to the container and opened it. "The ATCs made it out fine," she informed her team, before she hurried inside of the container and started to make the vehicles loose from their secure hold within the container. In less than a minute, the team had removed all ATCs from the container and instead thrown in their discarded EVSs. The container also carried their weaponry. Everybody got themselves equipped before finally closing the container, now setting it up with a previously prepared mechanism that the engineers had built into it for them. "Watch out for yourself," Andrzej ordered Sam, who had already gotten on top of the ATC assigned to her. Next to her sidearm, she had both a high-caliber Highsmith sniper rifle and the RR strapped to herself. "Roger," Sam replied, before putting the bike into high gear and taking off in the direction of the highest elevation in the surrounding area, which was a nearby hill with a clear view of the estate and surroundings, kicking up dirt and mossy plants in the process. Meanwhile, Andrzej and Tuya also started their cycles. "Last one there has to drive Admir," Tuya announced challengingly, and also clocked at the engine of her bike. Before Andrzej could answer, she was already putting the metaphorical pedal to the metal, and tore out of the clearing they had landed in with high speed. "Drive carefully," Andrzej yelled at her through their open comm line. "We can't have you be in an accident around here, for fuck's sake." As he turned the handle of his own bike to speed after her, the shuttle they had jumped out of minutes earlier could be seen slowly starting to begin its landing, some distance away from them, over the city that they had seen as they were falling. That meant Admir would also be in position soon. Just a few more minutes, and the mission could truly begin.